friends here today. Very nice to see you all again. And these are what we have as our main goals of this conference, and all of our conferences basically are centered around the idea that is presented in the title of these conferences: science and scientists. Generally, somehow science has forgotten the scientists. Science or science conferences are generally organized around the science and have completely neglected what the scientists themselves are contributing to that science and how they are contributing that, what is their role, and how science reflects back on who and what the scientists are. So this kind of impersonal and outward externalized knowledge that science has created and in such a great way has left out entirely the inner conscious contribution to the whole endeavor. And this, we feel, is a kind of a half knowledge, even if that, because without knowing the other half, without knowing the internal dimension of reality, from which the external has been definitely influenced and determined, what type of science is that? Not complete. Can never be complete if the whole of our totality of our experience, inward and outward, has not comprehended. So this science and scientists, these conferences, they are meant to awaken, bring to consciousness, the consciousness itself. Conscious science, we can call this. Science that is conscious of itself. And that means the scientists. The scientists are conscious of science. So what is that consciousness? Science cannot answer that and does not even look at that until the present day. Some revolution is taking place. And we now find journals of consciousness and different studies like that going on throughout the world, which was never mentioned before the present time. So some progress is being made, and we hope to inspire the further development and knowledge of that inner world, and especially in India, where these things have been studied for millennia, the role of consciousness, and how that vast body of knowledge and exploration has relevance today in the scientific turn toward what is the consciousness, what is the scientist contributing to the whole thing. So that's what we hope to accomplish in this, and today, not to expect the entire revolution will be based on this conference, but to add to that further progress in that direction. That's what we're aiming for today. And so we want to discuss in particular this relationship between subject, object, mind, body, thought and reality, we might say, or thought and being. So we look forward to all the interesting talks that the speakers will present today, and hope that we will have active participation through dialogue with the participants during the Q&A session. Anything else? Let me see. All right. you, Professor Butt. So it's nice to see all of you in this virtual meeting. I read that these virtual meetings are a way of spreading love and understanding, and not germs or disease. So one advantage of these virtual meetings. And we'll have them. Let me begin what I wanted to say for today. Someone, Krishna Keshava, has produced some PowerPoint slides. Okay. The title of the talk, Unity of Thought and Empirical Knowledge. Okay. We start with the first slide, the second slide.
We not yet got the slide on the screen started.
Okay. Unity of thought. Can you get to the next one? Can you see it?
Yeah, we see the folder, but not the full screen. Yeah.
Is it okay now?
Yeah. Can you make it a full screen? Yes. Full screen.
See. Okay.
We not came yet. Full screen. Full screen not came.
They can't see it.
They can't see it.
That's what he's saying. Oh, you can't hear him?
We can.
He's saying they cannot see the full screen.
Yeah. Now
can you see it?
Yes, now we can see. Correct.
Okay, next slide, please. Then I want to start with this quote before we go into the main talk. I wanted to start with this quote from Albert Einstein. Every scientist respects Albert Einstein as a brilliant and certainly most creative scientist that we have had in the past centuries. And he said, before mankind could be ripe for a science which takes in the whole of reality, a second fundamental truth was needed, which only became common property among philosophers with the advent of Kepler and Galileo. Of course, here he's talking about before these Kepler and Galileo, natural science or natural philosophy was called. Science took the form of natural philosophy, which was more a thinking science based on logic and reasoning than on experimental or experiential information. And with the advent of Kepler and Galileo, the experience of the outer world became a part of natural philosophy. Of course, not that it wasn't a part of natural philosophy before them, but the emphasis was shifted from the inner to the outer exploration of human thought. And he said, pure logical thinking cannot yield us any knowledge of the empirical world. All knowledge of reality starts from experience and ends in it. Propositions arrived at by purely logical means are completely empty as regards reality, because Galileo saw this, and particularly because he drummed it into the scientific world. He is the father of modern physics, indeed, of modern science altogether. Now, this is very typical of Einstein's thought. We know from his very earliest times, he was a Machian. Machian means a follower of Ernest Mach, who was known as a positivist. Positivists gave much emphasis to the external experiential or phenomenal world, and were kind of dismissive of the internal thought processes, rational and logical activities that occur, along with the empirical experiences. And Galileo was also of that nature. And Einstein, we also know his whole life after quantum mechanics, he was completely against the idea of quantum mechanics because, as we'll discuss later, quantum mechanics has taken a different as a different type of interpretation of science than the classical physics before it, and that put more emphasis upon the inner experience of things. And of course, Einstein was not at all in favor of that type of understanding. And he makes it very clear here that logical means are completely empty as regards reality. Of course, was Einstein's particular take on things, as we mentioned, from his early childhood until the rest of his life. Not that Einstein was quite correct in this regard. Rather, this is the way scientists today also think, and it is not. Let's say it is not correct. It is not correct because it can't be true that only experiences are what is giving us knowledge. It's not that thought is empty and it needs a filling with sensuous experience in order to become something tangible. This is a misconception. And although Einstein is great a scientist as he is, and all these scientists, Kepler, Galileo, and so forth, Newton, they all held this positivist viewpoint that experience was somehow was prior to and more important than, and was the substance of what thought only grasped, let's say, very scantily, like a shadow, and had no real substance to it, and only the sensuous had substance and meaning. This is the whole idea of the way modern science has developed. And so most scientists today will accept this viewpoint that Einstein is presenting. But we would like to challenge this completely and show, and the talk we're giving today will show that this is not at all the case. And we humbly ask that these great scientists forgive us for challenging their enormous works and the enormous benefits they have brought to society. And we humbly pray they will forgive us that we respectfully disagree with this viewpoint and why we disagree with that. So, our position will be what we know is not independent, but centrally dependent upon the subject, upon the scientist. What we know is not independent of, but centrally dependent upon the subject. At our last conference, one gentleman asked me, how do we combine subject and object in science? Science wants to be objective. How do we uh, coordinate that or uh, understand that in relationship to the subject? They seem to be worlds apart. And I answered simply, the object is what the subject knows it to be. The object is what the subject knows it to be. In other words, what is the question of a division between subject and object? To try to understand or think of things in this separated way is rather the impossible thing. It is rather impossible to think that subject and object can be separated. That's the difficulty. I don't find it difficult to understand the coordination of subject and object, but to understand their separation, their isolation from one another, that is difficult to understand. And yet that is exactly what modern philosophy of science has to deal with, the separation of subject and object. Rather, the problem is already solved if we think about it in this way. That the object is only what the subject knows it to be. And that eternal relationship, you can say, that permanent relationship between the two is already sealed in that idea. So what this says is that the content or concepts of theory or thought and the totality of empirical sensuous measurable experience are not separate. They can't be separate. The thought and the thing, even in English or in the German language, uh, uh, what is the German word for thought? Denk, denke, denke, and German thing is denke, ding, denke and ding. Similarity is there, just as in thought and thing we have in English. So the etymological roots of these words also indicate a very close connection. There's a very close connection between the two. It is not that they were ever conceived to be separate things. So this, what do you want to say? Lack of correspondence between the inner and outer world, although it has become such a prominent conception in modern science, as if there was an eternal antithesis between the two features, which are, in fact, inseparable in our knowledge and empirical and rational aspects of science. So the sensuous world seems different from the rational world because the senses are not able to detect thought or reason or concepts. The thought tree, given a picture here of trees, the thought tree and the actual tree outside my house seem quite distinct. Something like the reflection of a tree in the mirror or lake and the tree that is growing in the physical world. So there's a tree reflecting in the lake. And if you try to touch that tree, all you'll get is a wet hand. You won't get the tree. And there's an actual tree growing. That's the one you want to take home with you if you want a Christmas tree. So the thought tree is like the one in the lake. You can't touch that one with the senses and expect to get the feeling that you have with the original tree. So we think these are, and properly think these are quite different from one another. That is correct. But at the same time, they are not totally unrelated. The reflection, after all, is the reflection of the tree. It has a shape and size, and so forth, that the original tree has. So there is not a complete, although there is a difference, there is not a complete this separation. And we cannot imagine a reflection without that which is being reflected. Nor the thing without its reflection or shadow. So yet the reflection and its actual counterpart are certainly directly related. It is not that the difference in qualities means that there is no relationship. Hmm? So this mistake is there. People think they are different, therefore they're not related. But that's not correct. There's a difference, but there is a relationship as well. Just like north and south poles. Huh? They're different, but they're related. Uh, the north direction, south direction. They require each other in order to have any sense at all. Uh, so the thought and thing are related despite their vast difference in quality or qualities. We can say that mammals uh, is a concept of which cows are an example. Now, we know all cows are mammals, but we can say that all mammals are cows. So all apples are fruit, but that does not mean that all fruits are therefore apples. Uh, so we have a general concept, a universal concept, mammal. We can call it genus, the genus mammals. And we have the particular species under mammals, cows or horses or whatever. There is an identity between the two, but there's also a difference. Huh? There's an identity, cows are mammals, but mammals are not, all mammals are not cows. So there's a difference and an identity. Now this is a different kind of logic than we find in mathematics. In mathematics, if we say A equals B, then the converse is also true, B equals A. Huh? So mathematics can deal with the same logic we have in uh, concepts. It doesn't correspond to the same logic we have. We cannot represent the concept of universal and particular that we have in our language with the concepts of the logic of mathematics is very different. If we try to apply the logic of concepts to mathematics, we'll crash our program. Okay. Because if you say in mathematics A equals B, then the converse also has to be true. But it doesn't work in the realm of concepts. So that type of logic will not work on a mathematical level, won't work on a computer. Computer will become completely confused and give the wrong results, unexpected results. So what is that fundamental logical difference between the two? There, we can say that the logic of mathematics is based on identity, whereas the logic of concepts is based on identity and difference. Identity and difference as being identical, whereas in mathematics, it is based on identities. A thing must maintain its identity. It can't change its identity and when operating with mathematics. If the identity changes, it can it can cause some logical uh, difficulties. Uh, it'll cause contradictions, and mathematics can deal with that, and that we, the human intelligence, can deal with. So we experience singulars, as I said, or things, but we think in universals, thoughts, ideas, or concepts. Although they are different, they can also be identical or related. The logic in mathematical thinking is based on identity, but in conceptual thinking, the logic is based on identity and difference simultaneously. So we understand A equals B, B equals A, but in a universal may be found there in a particular or singular, but it doesn't mean that the universal becomes the singular. That can also happen. In logic, the universal can become, just like we say a mammal, a cow is a mammal. Cow is a singular in that case, but it can also become a universal because cow represents all cows. Huh? So it's a singular with respect to the universal, but it is also universal with respect to any instantiations of cow, instances of cow. It is also universal in that sense. So you see, in concepts, things can be very flexible, fluid, which in mathematics, if that occurred, would create great difficulties. But human mind, human intelligence can accommodate these things. We don't become confused by this, even though there may be some uh, uh, contradictions, apparent contradictions. So if we try to interpret nature in terms of mathematical thinking, we must accept the logic of identity as well. This means that if we try to explain the whole in terms of its parts, in which the parts maintain their same identity within the whole as outside of it, then we come up with mechanical models of complex things. You see? So this logic of identity is what allows, or is what we mean by mechanical systems. In other words, you have a gear in a clock. And that gear maintains its identity in the clock or outside the clock. If you wanted to change the gears in the clock, you can do it, no problem. Any clock, not only one clock, but any clock. All the gears are the same identity. The gear maintains its identity in the clock or outside of the clock. This is what we mean by a mechanical system. Doesn't matter, you can change the parts. Doesn't change the whole. The part doesn't change the whole. The whole maintains its identity. The part maintains its identity. And this is what we mean by a mechanical system. So this is the same logic as mathematics. And then we see that mathematics and mechanical systems are not really different from one another. That's why we can run mathematical equations on a computer. Computer is a machine, and mathematics can be done on the computer. Means the operations of mathematics, the operation of a machine, have the same logical uh, structure, which is called identity. So if, on the other hand, we interpret nature in terms of conceptual thoughts, we can adopt the logic of identity and difference, in which the whole contains parts that may be the same in different wholes, but are also different according to the whole of which it is a part. In other words, there are certain parts of the organic whole that we can also change with other parts, but there's a uniqueness to them also. And not that the heart of a human being and the heart of a cow are the same. You can't change those parts. Yet, according to science, the atom, carbon atom in a cow, the carbon atom in a human being, they're the same carbon atom. That confuses things. When we say like that, we think, well, cows and human beings are the same thing, just a different arrangement of uh, identical parts, identical atoms. It leads to something that we don't recognize in our natural experiences. And now cows and animals have something fundamentally different about them. But if we reduce everything to atoms, all identical atoms, every carbon atom is the same no matter where its situation is in, or whatever electron and maybe whatever particle you may think of. Excuse me. Then we run into this problem of monism. It's all one. It's all the same. And how is it that we're making distinctions? This is the problem. This is the problem with this idea of identity. It is not sufficient to explain difference. The monists in India especially, this is their problem also. They are of the opinion that the absolute is one. And all difference is illusion. No, that is not how we relate to things. If that were the case, we'd all be crazy. We'd all be an illusion. But that is not realistic, and not necessary also, if we recognize the logic that we're using. According to the logic of the mechanist or the monist, that all is one, there's not sufficient logic to present, to explain our experiences properly. So we accept that there is difference, there is oneness. And this is true, as we are pointing out, on a conceptual level. We can understand it at that level. If we try to get an immediate viewpoint of things, only see from that level of thinking, then of course we will run into these problems. So a matter of how to look at things, how to understand things, what angle of vision we need to capture the differences and identity, and not necessarily as a contradiction, but in a coordinated, harmonious way. So each element of existence is not only defined by its existence alone, but by its existence as well as that for the sake of which it exists. And this is another big problem. This is how Aristotle understood the complete comprehension of things. He called this final cause or purpose for which things exist as essential for the proper comprehension of things. So, Merry Christmas, everybody's this tree, I guess it's the meant to say Merry Christmas, or also points out how we use a thing will take on different type of significance. It's not that a tree is only something that grows in the forest and produces oxygen and it takes up the carbon dioxide, but it can also be used to celebrate holidays and so forth. And I think he wants to point that out, as well as being appropriate for the current season. So Aristotle is well known. He had proposed that things cannot have complete explanation without understanding the purpose, or that for the sake of which they exist. That has been eliminated by modern science, the purpose. Nothing exists for any purpose in science. That means that they're all identical. Everything is identical. Like I said, a carbon atom in a cow, carbon atom in a human being, there's nothing different about them. Because we don't consider what the carbon atom does in the human being, what it's there for, and what the carbon atom does in the cow and what it is there for. Now, the carbon atom is there for something in the cow, and the carbon atom is there for something in the human being. But that difference is not expressed in modern science. Carbon atom is a carbon atom. Doesn't matter what it's for, what role it plays. So it's a kind of isolated, abstract, we might call her idealized idea of the elements of reality. This idealized conception of things or elements and not having anything to do with that which they are, that for the sake of which they exist. And this destroys the whole meaning and purpose that we might find in reality. So we accept Aristotle was saying something very important. After all, Aristotle's philosophy had prominence in the world for almost 2,000 years until modern science came along and challenged that, especially Galileo. Galileo was out to prove that Aristotle was wrong in so many different ways. Was his intention. And he did not respect so much the philosophical approach of things. And he wanted to discount that. Just as many scientists today will say philosophy is not necessary. You find that in Stephen Hawking and others who try to claim that experience is all we need and philosophy doesn't have any role to play in all that. It only confuses things. But as we are pointing out, there is a relationship between thought, universals, and the singularities of things. And that relationship is inseparable. Inseparable. You take away the idea of mammal from a dog, what are you left with? We couldn't say what that is. You take the idea of fruit away from the apple, then what is it? These are necessary, substantial essentialities of things. How this is the way we deal with reality. So by removing this final cause or purpose in things, we again are back to mechanical systems. Every part is replaceable with any other part. And that kind of mechanical thinking is amenable to mathematical methods. And so these two play on each other. If we want to understand things mathematically, then we must understand them mechanically. If we want to understand things mechanically, then we must apply mathematics to explaining them. But this does not really describe the world. The real differences we encounter in life and how concepts and their content or reference are related, how meaning and purpose have a place in the world of thought and experience and existence. An example of how mental cognition affects sense perception may be experienced in the following optical illusions, such as the young woman, old woman. You can look at this picture. Some people can see an old woman. Some people can see a young woman. I don't know if you're able to see that. Some shift in interpretation comes about. And that is in the mind. Not the picture remains the same. The sense impression is the same. The picture not changing, but our interpretation of the picture, that is the mental part, the cognitive part, the focus, the attention, whatever we want to call it, the interpretation of the mind is at work in what we see. And not simply the reflection of an image on the eye, but there's an interpretation going on also in order to see. Now, and the same thing with the next illusion. Here we have, it might be more difficult to see, but here we have an old man, young man. that are capable of being seen. Uh, it may be hard to understand a young man, but if you see the nose as the chin of the young man looking away from the picture, as if he's looking away, then you might be able to see there is a young man also being illustrated in that picture. Then in the next uh, photograph, we have a what looks like bent lines. They're actually all parallel to one another. The lines are actually parallel, but we misinterpret the parallel nature of these lines because of the way the blocks are arranged here in a non-orderly fashion. This is actually called a cafe wall illusion. There was some cafe where the tiles of the wall were placed in a rather uneven way, and it gave this illusion to the person looking at that wall. And so he put it as one of these famous optical illusions that we are subject to. Again, how the mind interprets the thing is essential uh, to the perception of it. It's not that we simply see and that's it. The eye sees the object and it knows what it is. Some processing has to go on. Mental processing. I like to refer to the example of the robot. In a robot, we may put a photoelectric cell so it can detect light or changes in light. The robot has some wheels which is roaming about. Photoelectric light is there. As soon as it has the reflection of some light from an object that it encounters, a signal is sent to the robot and it makes a change in its servo motors. That electric current that is received by the reflected light in the photoelectric tube is fed to a computer which operates servo motors within the robot and makes the wheel turn so that it doesn't collide with the source of that reflection. So the photoelectric tube is like the eye. It doesn't only receive the image that's before it, but it feeds that current from the eye, from the received image, to the brain. And then the brain makes some um, behavioral change, or they say the brain is making some type of interpretation or uh, indicating that something should happen. Hmm? It's not that the photoelectric tube knows what to do. The eye doesn't automatically know how to interpret the image in front of it. It requires a computer. Photoelectric tube requires a computer in order to interpret whatever reception it's getting, whatever it's receiving. And not that the eye makes any judgments or anything else like that. The mind is required in order, or the computer is required, or be already programmed in order to say what happens when the receptor receives some data. In this way, we can understand there is a relationship between the mind and the eye, and there's a point. The eye doesn't do all the things that we think it does. And the mind behind it that allows it to make all these interpretations. Eye itself, the organ of the eye, has none of that ability built within its structure. And anyhow, we have um, our conception of the solar system represents a clear example of how we combine rational thinking with perceptual experience. Perceptually, we experience the sun passing through the sky from east to west. Despite that experience, we understand that the Earth is rotating on its axis and the sun is stationary. In the Copernican conception, this is how we understand the universe. It is not a mere experiential data of seeing the sun moving. Everyone looks at the sun and they see it moving. That's the experience. That's what we all experience because of the way the environment and around our eye promotes that type of, which is actually an illusion. And we say, no, that's not what is happening. We deny our experience and accept our rational explanation of the thing. So it is not that reasoning and experience are opposed to one another. They can be justified as having both a contribution to what we understand our reality to be. When we leave our house and go to the office, we rationally presume that the house continues to exist even though we cannot perceptually experience it. In this way, our idea of the world consists of both rational and perceptual aspects, right? And not based upon perception that we say our house is still there when we leave it. We have rationally concluded that the house is still going to be there when we go back because that's the way we always experience it. But it's not based merely upon experience. It's based upon something we have concluded and believe, despite the non-perception of things. Not that when we don't perceive something, then we say it doesn't exist. So existence is not based upon mere perception. It is also based upon a certain reasoning that we incorporate into the perceptual world of our life. It is said that when a baby, a young child, when the mother comes into the room of the young child and then leaves the room and then enters again, the child does not recognize the second entry as being the same person. They haven't made that rational connection between the first entry of the mother and the second entry as being of the same identical person. Until the child reaches what they call the age of reason, then these kind of things are there. They see the same image. They can't understand that that same image is the same thing until after they have reached a certain level of rational understanding. So it's not the perception that tells us that the mother is the same, and all the instances of leaving and coming into perceptual view again. It is actually a function of reasoning that allows us to connect those things in that way. So in modern science, this fact is especially true, although no one has ever experienced an atom directly. The rational assumption based on atomic theory is that they underlie all perceptual existence. So we cannot actually claim that perceptual experience is the only evidence we rely upon in science. Arthur Eddington, he made the famous quote that an electron is something we don't know doing what we don't know. No one has ever seen, you can't see an electron. Then what is it? You can't tell what it's made of. It's an elementary particle. And according to Heisenberg, we don't know exactly where it's doing at any particular point in space-time. So we're always working with postulating things according to theory, according to thought. We're postulating that there are things that are not even available to perception. Then what is the problem between thought and thing? Why do we make such a distinction between them when they're using that all the time? Descartes, uh, sorry, a misunderstanding of sense certainty arises when we think that something as simple as saying that object A is next to, in quotes, next to object B, and we think it is merely a result of the vision of the eye. However, the fact is that the eye organ does not possess the ability to make such judgments about the objects of its perceptions, such as next to. There's no function within the eye that allows it to judge that one thing is next to another. This is the point. There's rods and cones and various other chemicals within the eye. But what is it that allows it to see that A is next to B? Two different objects are next to each other. There's nothing. There's nothing in the eye that allows it to do that we know of. Thus, the exercise of judgment, which is what next to means, requires the organ we call mind. Judgment or comparison are abilities that do not reside in the sense organs. The ear, the eye, the touch, smell, taste, all these detectors, they are not complex enough to allow for judgments, comparisons, to say what they are. And that has to come from a mind. Thus, a mind is necessary for the senses to function. It's not that the senses function in the way they do when we say, well, this object is next to that. Obviously, we can see that. It's not the eye that's doing that. And the eye can't do that. That this object is bigger than that object. Even that is not the business of the eye to tell us. That kind of comparison, that kind of judgment is not done by the eye organ. It is done by the mind. Thus, it's necessary to understand that their mind is active in perception, and it cannot be separated from it. Historically, there's been a great misunderstanding about the proper relation between reason, thinking, or cognition, and perception. This is true for both philosophers and scientists. The metaphysics of the past upon which much of sciences has been built is riddled with such misunderstandings. Descartes separated cognition and perceptually extended matter as if they were unrelated. Galileo made a similar severance to the foundation of science on the path of applying the mathematical method to such study of nature that now pervades science. This was discussed in our book, Idols of the Mind, and versus True Reality, how this came about. So in order to understand what we may call Galileo's error, it is necessary to examine the metaphysical ontology, how he separated and isolated consciousness from the perceptual objects of consciousness. In one of his writings, called the Assayer, Galileo divided all characteristics we encounter in everyday experience into primary and secondary qualities. Now, this was a common metaphysical conception of the scholastics that actually came originally from Aristotle. Aristotle was also interested in understanding what is the prime, what he called prime matter, the primary nature of matter. And so the scholastics took that up and they tried to divide our understanding of matter into primary and secondary qualities. And Galileo, Descartes, and Newton, they were all operating under that metaphysical ontology, that there was something specifically identifying matter that was not um, uh, that was different from cognition, the essential qualities of cognition, and that essential difference between cognition and matter require that there was something that was different. And they call that primary quality, which you could not find within thought, was there in matter. Of course, Aristotle, when he spoke of primary matter, many people also misunderstand him, and but he finally concluded that the primary matter was not anything at all except potentiality. It was not a thing. He called it potentiality or dunamis. Dunamis or dynamics. Dunamis means potentiality. That out of which actuality could come. He had three things: dunamis, energia, and enteleki. These three terms he came up with to explain the potentiality and the actuality as it is formed, and that which raised potentiality or modified potentiality to become actuality. You all know in science, we all know what potential means. Not manifest, but is there. Potential energy, whatever. Potential, I mean, there's energy, but it's not manifest. When it becomes manifest, that becomes actual or expressed energy. So there's potentiality, there's kinetic energy, so forth and so on. The potential energy doesn't really do anything until it becomes kinetic energy, then it acts. So what causes that change to occur from potential to actual? That is called enteleki, the actualization of the potential. That's how Aristotle understood it. But that potentiality was turned into something substantial by the modern ontologists. They tried to turn it into a thing. Potentiality is not a thing. It exists, but it's not substantial. But the modern thinkers, modern philosophers, and then the scientists, they got focused on positive thinking, or positivist interpretation of reality, and thought of the primary substance as something actually existing. And this is what caused the problem of trying to interpret that primary stuff in a physical way. But it's actually a concept of potentiality in Aristotle. When that happened, however, there we find the disjunction between conception and perception. We created some kind of a substantial difference between the two, when the difference is actually conceptual. In this way, Descartes, who was contemporary of Galileo, separated extended matter, what he called extended matter, as if it was unrelated to um, cognition. And Galileo made a similar severance to set the foundation of science on the path of applying the mathematical method to the study of nature that now pervades science. This was discussed in our book, Idols of the Mind. No, I already said that. So, so we can understand this, that when Descartes said there was extended matter, that the difference between matter and mind was that matter was extended. Extended means measurable, uh, substantial, what do you want to say, external, where mind was not extended. You cannot locate thoughts in space. As soon as you say extended, we mean spatial. So Kant established the spatiality or extension of primary matter. And cognition was not spatial or extended. So he divided reality into two categories, two uh, pigeon coops, you can say. One was res extensus, and the other is res cogitans. Uh, the extended world and the cognitive world. He said they were two different. Now, why is extension something special for Descartes, measurable and so forth? Why is that something special? Why is that outside of consciousness rather than also a conscious thought or a concept? This was never explained by Kant. So in his book, in his writings of called the Assayer, as we mentioned, he described this difference between the primary and secondary properties of matter. By no stretch of imagination can I conceive of any corporeal body apart from the conditions of size, shape, motion, etc. But I do not at all feel myself compelled to conceive of bodies as necessarily conjoined with such further conditions as being red or white, bitter or sweet, having sound or being viewed or possessing a pleasant or unpleasant fragrance. Hence I think that taste, colors, odors, and so forth are no more than mere names so far as the object in which we place them is concerned, and that they reside only in the consciousness. Hence, if the living creature were removed, all these qualities would be wiped away and annihilated. Well, doesn't that sound familiar to all scientists? This is where it comes from. That the beginning, the Big Bang, was just some extended particles, however small they were. And no consciousness, nothing else was present. It wasn't needed. Because this was the prime matter. This is coming from Galileo. This is the scientific viewpoint today. What he believed in the 17th century is currently being entertained by the 21st century scientists. Doesn't anything ever become old in science? Do we maintain the same ideas as they had then till today? Is that progress in science or what? So what Galileo thinks is the case is not ontologically the fact of the matter, namely that the phenomenal existence of objects, including their size and other measurable properties, are all the contents, are actually all the contents of consciousness, and none have an independent status apart from that. That a thing has extension has weight or whatever it does, motion or whatever. That is also within consciousness. That is also a content of consciousness. It's not that consciousness is not active in formulating those ideas or those concepts. Not that extension has a certain quality to it that is not within consciousness. It's a conscious idea that there is something extended as a part of our phenomenal experience, that things are extended, that they exist in space and time and so forth. It is not that anything is outside of consciousness. In fact, we can understand in a logical way that consciousness is as much conscious of size as it is of color. Galileo wanted to separate the concept of extension or measurability as something existing on its own outside of consciousness, when in fact it is within it. It is one of the experiences, phenomenal experiences, or what we as conscious beings experience of whatever reality is. We cannot separate it in such a way. It is merely an I think, an opinion, although he gave a little reasoning on what he thinks could cause that separation. That is not. He missed the point already. That it is as much within consciousness as any other quality or quantity. This is what we understand today. In quantum mechanics now, how does modern science come to think about these things or understand these things? In quantum mechanics, an explanation known as the Copenhagen interpretation, metaphysical term, views quantum mechanics as providing knowledge of phenomena, but not as pointing to really existing objects, which it regards as residues of ordinary intuition, also called naive reality in philosophy. This makes it an epistemic theory. It explains our knowledge of the world, but is not about the world itself, if we can speak of such. In other words, quantum theory is about our knowledge of the world, not the world. You can understand the difference. Quantum theory is what we know about a so-called world, not about the world itself. This is what Bohr's understanding of quantum mechanics amounted to. It's about our consciousness or knowledge of the world, about our consciousness of the world, and not about the world. What can we say about the world if we're not conscious of it? Again, consciousness of the world means that even extended things are part of the way we conceive of the world. So we're dealing with our concepts, with our consciousness, with our knowledge. We're not dealing with the world of things. It's necessary for a phenomenal observer, a finite observer, with a mind, with a consciousness, to see things in this way. This is what quantum mechanics has brought us back to. And in Vedanta, science is also about what is known to consciousness and not something outside of that. Vedanta deals with this type of world situation, this type of conception of reality, that everything is within consciousness. This is Vedantic science. It's based upon that platform, not about a world existing on its own, independent. We may think about reality outside of consciousness, as Kant proposed with his Ding an sich, or thing in itself, or Hegel explained in his absolute reality for itself and by itself. But these two different ideas of the in itself beyond consciousness must not be confused. This is a very subtle point. Kant was starting from the viewpoint of the finite consciousness. Uh, he accepted Descartes' I think, therefore I am. He accepted Descartes' foundation of all knowledge as being based upon the I think uh, and its existence. In other words, an ego. Descartes had introduced this idea of I think. The ego of the I think is consciousness, basically. A finite consciousness, starting with the self, ignoring all other relationship to the whole. He looked into himself and felt himself to be the whole and the basis of everything else. And this I think, and this consciousness, this finite consciousness. And Kant began with that. He didn't call it that, though. He called it the unity of apperception. That point in which all other things were unified. The whole unity of experience was centered upon this unity of apperception, which he didn't call ego, but that was understood later. But Hegel was not a victim to that finite conception of self. He understood that the self, or the I, was only thought of as a singular individual apart from the universal. You see, everyone says I, and not only an individual that says I, everyone says I. And what does that mean? I is a universal. What is the universal I? It's called we. There's an I, and there's also a we. Both are first person experiences, but from a singular and from a universal perspective. So Kant did not quite comprehend that universal perspective of the I, or ego, the universal ego. He did not incorporate that in his philosophy, but Hegel did. So when Hegel says there is a reality or universal consciousness in and for itself, that did not put it outside of the finite consciousness, but included the finite consciousness within it as identical and different, just like the universal mammal and the individual cow, individual species cow, are not outside of one another, but within one another. So Kant understood things from the standpoint of finite consciousness or subjective consciousness. Hegel reached a point of infinite consciousness or universal consciousness we may call objective, or that which is true for all. Although both subjective finite consciousness, although each subjective finite consciousness may know only some limited portion of it. In order to form a science that takes account of the entire reality, including science and scientists, including consciousness within its domain, it is necessary to recognize the limitations that a mathematical mechanistic view gives us of nature. Mathematical naturally implies mechanistic. That is why machines can perform mathematical calculations. Both are based on the principle of identity, as we explained before. Non-mechanistic science cannot be explained using mathematics. Furthermore, mathematics, as Aristotle also understood, cannot give us any clue as to the intrinsic nature of things. It can only describe from an outer perspective what undefined things can do. In order to explore the inner nature of things, we require metaphysics, and this is something modern science neglects, although it does so unconsciously. Science is going about as if it knows what it's talking about, but it's actually ignorant of the metaphysical foundations which underlie it. So it is so-called knowledge, incomplete knowledge, that it thinks is complete. A more complete science requires a more comprehensive approach to understanding not only the external description of things, but also the internal nature of what it is we are describing. Mathematics is not the language of nature. It fails to grasp the qualitative aspects that accompanies the quantitative features of nature, as well as the non-mechanistic teleological nature of organic reality. It cannot explain causality, only describe it. Equations don't cause anything to happen. Huh? There's the inner nature of things when comprehended that provide the causes or reasons behind what happens in the phenomenal sphere. Without diving deep into reality behind the superficial show of the visible or phenomenal world, we cannot know the role of reason that is everywhere present in both the sensuous and intellectual spheres of the whole truth of spirit in which we are participants. These conferences are meant to promote the explanation of our awareness of a more complete and comprehensive science of the true whole organic reality of which we are part. By study of science, its history, its ideas, and the metaphysics that remain hidden to many scientists, along with a study of the Vedanta philosophy of consciousness that has already been given a more luminous explanation in the teachings of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, a truly scientific, comprehensive, and more spiritually satisfying conception of reality may be cultivated and realized for the benefit of all of us. I hope I didn't go over my time, did I?
Thank you, Pujya Shri Madhavpurji Maharaj. You have covered a very wide range of thought, and your presentation was quite erudite, as well as something which is a matter of learning for us. Because of paucity of time, let me only review a few points that you have made. In fact, yours was a very wonderful presentation. You have rightly pointed out that inquisitive human mind always tries to know the reality, what exactly the reality is, both internal as well as external, and comes to the conclusion about primacy, primordiality of consciousness. Science in the beginning was concerned with the inner world also. That's why psychology was a part of philosophy earlier, but then later on it shifted to external world. I think it's high time that the internal world also should be given equal importance. We make a distinction between pure consciousness, which is unitary, and relational consciousness. And only within the realm of relational consciousness, science can operate. And for that pure unity in consciousness, you have to go beyond time, beyond science. In relational science, we make a distinction between subject and object. They are not separate. They are only different, you have rightly pointed out, but they need to be transcended in the realm of pure consciousness. So long as we are concerned with relational consciousness, well, we have to reckon with this distinction, but ultimately we have to transcend that. You have also rightly pointed out that there is a difference between a mechanical whole, which is guided by laws of mathematics and logic, law of identity in particular. We also have corresponding law of contradiction and excluded middle. But in the spiritual realm, it is the law of identity alone, where there is an organic unity. You have identity come difference. And so just like an organic whole, the whole is one unitary, but it has multiple parts. The parts belong to the whole, and therefore they are to that extent identical with the whole, but yet a particular whole doesn't constitute the particular part doesn't constitute the entire whole, and therefore there is a difference as well. So this organic unity is a unity is identity in difference, and I think you have rightly pointed that out. You have also in this context pointed out that difference doesn't mean contradiction. Difference may be open-ended and may have a relational, say, approach to the other entities which are to be related. You made a reference to the final cause of Aristotle, which provides a teleology to the cosmic process rather than the mechanistic understanding of it. You also pointed out how the dualism, which was there in the Greek thought, got its culmination in Descartes, but we have Cartesian dualism giving rise to many problems to which Spinoza, Leibniz, and others tried to give answer. Later on, ghost in the machine idea was also floated, and many other thinkers. Still, the problem persists in the history of Western thought. But in Indian context, we overcome the distinction between mind and matter. They are two facets of reality, no doubt, but they are not to be taken as something ultimate. So we are really enlightened by your lucid, exhaustive, and can say mind-searching presentation. Thank you very much. Over to the organizer for the next
Some question answers. Some question answer can be taken.
Yeah. We can. Of course, the presentation was very lucid and clear, and but it can be thought-provoking as well. So questions are invited. Please unmute yourself. Unmute yourself and then.
Swamiji, pranam. Sir, pranam Lakshmi. Just I am having a little bit doubt to know about what is the reality outside of consciousness. What is the reality outside of consciousness?
Reality is consciousness, in fact. No question of inside or outside. We say Sat Chit, Ananda. So Sat and Chit are one and the same. But let Swamiji respond.
I'm not sure. You're asking what is the reality outside of consciousness?
Yeah, this is his query.
You're asking that. Then
yeah.
This is an assumption that there is a reality outside of consciousness. All we can say is that consciousness may be limited. Our consciousness may be limited, and beyond that limitation there are something. Not that it has any existence outside of consciousness, but that consciousness may be limited. And our certain consciousness is certainly limited, is subjective, and therefore finite. And because we are finite within an infinite reality, and a reality that is more extensive than what our consciousness is able to comprehend, doesn't mean that that reality is different from consciousness. It can also be within consciousness, but a broader consciousness than our own. And that type of consciousness is said to exist within Vedanta. Vedanta says there is an infinite consciousness. We may call that God or whatever. Hegel called it the reality by itself and for itself. It is objective to us, but it also includes us within it, just as mammal is a universal concept, but it includes cow within it. It includes horse within it. It includes man within it. So there can be universal ideas and particular ideas or individual ideas, but they are not necessarily outside of one another in the sense of not having any relationship, internal relationship. You see? So although mammal is greater than what the cow can conceive. and it's even greater than what just a man represents. It is nonetheless part of our understanding of things. It's not that universal is something that is different from singular. And different, but is also within us. A man can understand mammal, that he is a mammal. But he understands that mammal is also part of what he is. It is also part of himself, although it is something more than himself. In the same way, a finite consciousness may not understand the infinite or comprehend the infinite, but he is part of that infinite consciousness, that objective consciousness, that reality of which he is but a part is also within him, and is not something totally external to him. And this is called Achintya Bheda Bheda Tattva. It's within and yet without. Dr. Bhatt was pointing out, this identity cum difference is there, is the logic within the whole of our understanding of things, as the natural understanding that all of us have as rational beings. I hope that's clear.
Yeah, I think it's very clear.
Yeah,
Any other query?
Dhanwas Maharaj,
Yes.
good day to everyone. Maharaj, just a couple of questions. So given different level of understanding, I know it might be related, not be related, but I'll ask it anyway. Given different level of understanding, how can one understand spiritual knowledge as it is transmitted by the master without corrupting it? Because obviously we are all different, our subjective experiences are different, our knowledge level of knowledge is also different. So we cannot understand the master's mind completely and his experiences and his realizations. That was one. And the second one, Maharaj, once the understanding of the student and the master is completely synchronized, is the subjective experience is also similar of the reality?
Well, I think in Plato's conception, it's very useful to understand that goodness has a place in knowledge. Goodness, virtue, they all are, although they have the relationship between knowledge and virtue or goodness is not understood today. In his thought, goodness and virtue were necessary in order for knowledge to be clear. In other words, knowledge did not come from reading or studying or thinking about things. But
Yeah,
knowledge,
we require sadhana for that, a particular training of body, will, and mind. So without that, we cannot properly comprehend the verdicts of the master. Sadhana is required.
so this acquisition of or coming to the stage of goodness or virtue is what clarifies knowledge for us. Just like if you have muddy water and you want to see the bottom of that water, what's at the bottom, you have to wait until all the dust settles and then you can see it. So like that, the impurities of the heart are also important for understanding knowledge. And therefore the spiritual master is dependent upon according to the purity, the spiritual purity of the master. If he is a pure soul, pure devotee, then that knowledge will be pure, will be clear. And insofar as that is lacking in us, then we won't be able to come to the same conclusion or similar conclusion. Not that everyone sees in the same way. There, in the pure world, there is also some distinction. It always remains identity and difference. So some will be identical, some will be different according to each perspective. We all have a perspective of the absolute. Just like a diamond. A diamond has different perspectives. From one, it looks green. From another perspective, it looks blue. From another perspective, red or yellow. Yet it's one diamond with different facets. So they're also in the pure world of spirit, in which the heart has become free from all unvirtuous and evil tendencies. And then that knowledge will be seen, even though it may be from different perspectives, but it will still be coordinated, harmonized, or one with its differences. Does that answer the question?
Yes, Maharaj. And the second part was, once that happens, the realization is exactly the same as the master's, correct?
Well, similar and maybe different also.
Different also.
Just like you see with two eyes. One eye can see a certain amount of the reality, but two eyes allows you to see it in more two dimensions, a little bit more than just one dimension. So in the spiritual world, the pure world of spirit, seeing things in slightly different ways is not a detraction of things, but it adds to the richness of the experience. The complements doesn't, just like in an orchestral composition, there's not only one instrument playing, but so many different instruments playing, but they all contribute to the beauty of the performance because of that difference. Not doesn't ruin it, doesn't make it worse because of the differences, different instruments there. It makes it better, more full, more rich, and like that. In the spiritual world, it is also the richness of the differences that contribute to one another and make it a very beautiful and fulfilling experience. It's not that difference is always conflicting. There's conflicting differences and there are harmonious differences. In that place, harmonious differences are prominent.
Thank you, Maharaj.
Any other query?
Yeah, I am Anil Kumar here. I want to ask one question, sir.
Please.
Yeah. So, our consciousness cannot capture reality related to magnetism, time, and radioactivity, radiation. So, reality which is made up of these things is different reality.
I could not hear what your question was.
Sir, I am.
What you can say. Yeah. Please ask.
I'm audible, sir?
Yeah.
Okay. So my question is, our consciousness cannot capture magnetism, time, and radioactive radiation. So reality, which is made of these three things, is making knowledge, which is making different reality.
Is time, radiation, and what else did you say?
Magnetism.
Magnetism. Is magnetism, time, and radiation outside of consciousness? Is that what you're saying?
Is it producing different reality, he says, Maharaj.
Yeah.
Is producing that our mind could not comprehend, and then is it creating a different reality? That's what he's saying.
Well, that your mind cannot comprehend something does not mean it cannot be comprehended. Your mind may not comprehend it. It doesn't mean that it's not uncomprehended by everyone, every mind. So there is a mind that can comprehend those things. But you have to improve your mind to come to that stage. Improve your knowledge. Increase your knowledge, that's all. It may be outside of your ability to conceive. But that does not mean that there is no one who can conceive those things. Can you agree with that?
Yes, sir. Yeah.
So it's just a matter of progress of knowledge, a matter of progress of knowledge to come to that plane. Our master can conceive those things. Master of those things is capable of explaining that and understanding that. We may not be in that position, but it doesn't mean that such a position does not exist. We cannot judge everything in comparison to ourselves. We may be very insignificant and fallen, and it's healthy to think in that way, and that I am not the greatest person or the only person in the world. Who knows what is what? There may be others beside myself who have that knowledge, and we have to find that and try to raise ourselves by coming in contact with such persons and learning about those things, if that is our interest. You may not know quantum mechanics, but if you go to a teacher who knows it, you can learn. You may not know calculus, but if you go to a professor of mathematics, you can learn from them. So that is the basis of modern education. Modern education does not tell us, go home, read your books, and learn everything. It tells you, come to the professors. They're all gathered there at the educational institution and learn. That is what education is based upon. So same thing in spiritual knowledge. You are not advised to try to meditate in your own way to try to come to the higher realization of spirit. Our advice is to go to the professor of spirit. Who knows? Tattva Darshana. Bhagavad Gita, Krishna explains. Tadvidi pranipatena pariprasnena sevaya. Vidikshati te jnanam jnaninais tattva darshana. Tadvidi means to know the truth. Tad is the truth. Vidi means to know. To know the truth, what do you have to do? Approach the tattva darshani. Approach one who knows that truth. And then you can learn by hearing, humbly hearing, and serving in so many different ways, and purifying the heart so that you can come to the level of purity of virtue, goodness, that the spiritual master has already attained. And thereby everything will be automatically revealed to you with the purity of our own hearts. There's a process, it's a scientific process. If we can capture what they are saying, and the different philosophers has given us hints of how to do that, and Veda, sadhana, and so forth, that can also help us in that endeavor. We are advised in that way to make our progress in life. Hare Krishna.
Thank you very much, Swamiji, for your very illuminating responses. We are really grateful to you for enlightening us. Yeah. Over to the organizers now.
Thank you, Professor. All right. What else? Thank you for all the questions.
Oh, I'm sorry. You can hear me, right? My name is Lakshman Kanduri.
I think we finished the question and answer session. Now, the next session, we are already delayed. We have to
Okay, go ahead.
Next session.
We can ask one more question, is possible? Let him ask a question.
Okay, man.
Okay.
Yeah, my quick question is related to how inanimate is has attained awareness, has there been a process of evolution? And if so, what are those stages of evolution before inanimate became aware or matter became aware? Is there any light you can shed? You could.
We have to think of the question, how does the inanimate become animate? If you think of an analogy, if you have put a candle under a bushel, then the light of the candle can't be exposed to the rest of it. Can show you what the environment is like because the candle is covered. However, you take the bushel off, then the candle can show itself. But if you put a bushel over empty space and you take it away, then nothing will be there. You'll still be the same darkness, the bushel there or without. Huh? So light doesn't come from darkness. What this means. Darkness can come from light being covered. But the light has to be there before we can uncover it, and then the darkness is revealed. If the darkness is under the bushel, and we take the bushel off, nothing is shown. So light comes from, we can say light doesn't come from darkness, but it has to be there, simply covered. In the same way, consciousness is there in everything, but it's covered. So it's just the uncovering of consciousness that reveals that consciousness within everything, potentially within everything. So we have to understand what is the process what the process is of uncovering what is already there. Now, evolution gives a backward understanding of this thing. It says from the unliving or inanimate nature, animate nature comes. Like from the darkness, light comes. It can't go that way. Vedic conception is that things go from up to down. They become covered. The higher thing becomes covered, and it appears to be in a lower position because of that covering. And it's the removal of that covering that is necessary to come to the higher plane. So what is that process? A removal of covering. And there we have what Dr. Bhatt was talking about, sadhana. By engaging in activities that are of higher nature, that are connected with the higher nature, the lower nature can be dissolved, and the higher nature can be revealed. See, even inanimate things, if they are engaged in the service of sadhana, how to take a brick, and use it to build a temple, and that brick will be benefited. It may not be a brick in its next manifestation. That's a fact. That's how Veda understands. So everything has its utility in the service of the infinite. But it has to make that connection. It has to somehow be connected with that through those who are engaged in devotional or those who are engaged in their fixation, their concentration, their dedication to that higher realm, that higher goal. They can utilize everything and bring it to its higher position. Just like today, you may not understand all these things, but by hearing those from those who have experienced those other things, we can learn also how to engage ourselves in that pursuit, have some idea, have some direction, and in that way we can elevate ourselves. That is the process, not evolution as Darwin had taught, but the evolution of consciousness, subjective evolution of consciousness. Even a brick has a subjectivity to it. It's alive. We can see that. Brick will, after some time, a long time, but after some time, brick will dissolve. And they call it entropy death in this organization. There's something moving in the brick. Scientists know that also. Electrons are in constant motion. Actually, the brick is made of entirely of movement, according to physics. So there's something alive there. We call it inanimate, but that's because we can achieve those things. So there's life everywhere. Consciousness is there also. Okay.
Thank you.
Just as light is self-luminous, consciousness is sui generis. The only thing is that the covering which is there, which makes consciousness inanimate, that covering has to be removed. And this is the message of the Vedantic thought also. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
So should we now pass on to the next session or what?
Yeah, and who is the MC that he's managing? He has to. I'm not sure who is the managing. Dr. Sumangala is the MC or who is there? Okay.
Indeed, it was a wonderful talk and discussion about the unity of thoughts and empirical knowledge, and more precise answers of some queries. My humble obeisances to you, Dr. Madhavpuri Maharaj. And before moving towards our next session of the conference, we would like to offer my humble obeisances to Srila Acharya Maharaj, Shripad